Okay. So, thank you very much for joining with us today. Today we have Andy Schubert, who's a PhD candidate attached to the University of Cambridge. And formerly, he was also teaching at the Open University of Sri Lanka. And Andy, I know, has also worked a lot with the SSA and done some research around the topic that we are planning to discuss today on masculinities. Andy will first, try to kind of, build a conversation with us on this topic and touch upon a few practical examples of, how masculinities are being practiced in the society. He will also distinguish between patriarchy and masculinity, sort of try to understand what's the difference between the two concepts. And also, he will discuss some prospects for future research to see some of the gaps where some of the young researchers could take forward this discussion towards. And I think one of the things that we discussed also, someone also raised this question, why would a feminist platform discuss, masculinity? So we can have that discussion, beyond the face value. And over to you, Andy. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And over to you.
Thanks, Avanti, and thank you to you and the Sangam Collective for inviting me. I'm really excited to be involved and participate. So thank you very much, and thank you for that generous introduction. I have a short presentation, hopefully short, but some kind of a presentation. But also feel free to interrupt me, ask questions if you have, and we can go from there as we go. Okay, so I've titled this kind of presentation and discussion manner, Masculinities in Question and Contradiction. Um, and so I want to begin with some caveats, some things that I want to put forward and say, no, I can't be held responsible for certain things. Though Avanti very generously said that I have done some work in this area, it's been a little while. I am not an expert in the field. Masculinity is something that I find useful as a framework for thinking and for analysis. But I'm in no sense an expert in the field. There are people who are far more knowledgeable than me. So I just want to make that clear and to defer to them. Also, I think there's a danger when you're talking about masculinity that, this could seem like, there are ideal men or that I'm the ideal person to talk about this. I'm in no way ideal. I'm still learning about masculinity. I'm still figuring out a lot of the ways in which I have been socialized and conditioned into behaving in particular ways. So I think that's important to keep in mind that this is not kind of a conclusion that I have reached. This is a journey that I am on. A lot of what I will be speaking today will be also about English scholarship. I realize that's a limitation. I'm speaking in English, so that's also a limitation. I think there's a lot of work to be done in this area, and I'll hopefully be able to touch on some of that as I go. And so that means that I'm going to do today is hopefully a fairly basic introduction to the concept of masculinity and masculinities, and I'll give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. But before I do that, I want to talk about it a little bit because I don't want to make myself an expert on masculinity. I want to talk a little bit about my personal journey and how I got here. I think one of the ways in which masculinity has really mattered to me was it really helped me to understand privilege. Um, I mean, I grew up in a fairly middle class family. I spoke English at home for various reasons. And I went to an all boys school, a private school, um, where masculinity was very, very prominent. And but the strange thing was, and of course, I had a very kind of, in some ways, very radical mother who, believed that I have two brothers as well, so that all three of us should do housework. We should help in the house. We should do certain things. My dad also helps in the house. So there was, I mean, I mean, I know, but despite all of this, it was not something, masculinity was not something I ever thought about, right? Like, I actually, the first time I actually had to think about masculinity was because I was in an interview and somebody asked me, in an interview for a research, and somebody asked me, how do you know that you're a man? And I was just really stumped by that question because I had never been asked that question. And it was an interview and I had to give a really quick answer, and I kind of stumbled because I know I'm not a woman. And then I was like, well, that's a terrible answer. How do I know that? And so I think one of the ways in which I've started to think of privilege after that conversation is that privilege is not having to be conscious of an identification, right? And uh, that until someone asks me, "How do you know that you're a man?" I'd never have to think about what does it mean to be a man. How do I know this? What are the ways in which I am, a man in certain ways, right? And of course, I knew kind of the kind of basics of gender theory, that gender is socially constructed, and that it is not biological. I knew that, but I never had to think about that in terms of my own masculinity. Um, and I think that this is really interesting. The more I've thought about this, I've come back to that moment in various ways. In part because I feel like for men, that sense of masculinity is rarely questioned uh, in a very direct way. I think there are indirect ways in which it is questioned, but is rarely questioned in a direct way. I think for women, and again, speaking from what people have told me, I could be wrong about this. Um, the sense of femininity is something that you're constantly being made aware of through, for example, your own bodily actions, for example, menstruation, but also socially, right? Like what people keep saying. People keep asking women a lot, well, when you're getting married, when you're going to have children. There's a sense that oh, you're too old, you may not have children, or you look like this, it's bad for having children. Like so, there's this constant sense in which women are constantly reminded. I feel I could be wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected on this. That their femininity matters, right? Their sense of social their gender matters. Whereas for men, actually, you find that there's actually very little of that kind of invocation, that reminding in our society. There's constantly a sense of, oh, boys will be boys and various kinds of things. But I mean, you might be asked sometimes if you're older when you're getting married, but even that is rarely a sense of, you know, why does this make you a man or not? Right. And so I think really that question really had caused me to think a lot about privilege and privilege as being something, and it's helped me to think about lots of things, not just in terms of masculinity, but like privilege more generally, um, as being something that you don't have to be conscious of. Because until somebody asked me that question, I was never conscious of the fact that I was a man. And that is really where kind of this journey kind of, I would say, started. Avanda, did you have a question for me or something?
No, I will just say that we will be providing Sinhala kind of some form of explanation, a summary as well.
Okay.
මේ අද සංවාදයට සම්බන්ධ වෙලා ඉන්න අයට මේ සිංහලෙන් තමන්ට තියෙන ගැටලු ඉදිරිපත් කරන්නත් පුළුවන්. ඒවා අපි ඇන්ඩිත් එක සාකච්ඡා කරලා ඒවා අපි මේ පරිවර්තනය කරන්න. මේ ඇන්ඩි පටන් ගන්නකොටත් කිව්වා මම හිතන්නේ ඉංග්‍රීසි භාෂාවෙන් ලියන එකත් සහ කතා කරන සිද්ධවීමත් එක්තරා විදිහේ වරප්‍රසාදාත්මක තත්ත්වයක් කියලා. ඉතින් ඒ නිසා මේ අපි යාට දැන්ට කතා කරන්න ඉඩ දීලා ඊට පස්සේ අපි මේකේ සාරාංශයක් ඉදිරිපත් කරන්න. ඊට පස්සේ අපිට ගැටලු ඉදිරිපත් කරන්න පුළුවන්. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. Thank you, Avanti. Sorry about that. So yeah, so that's in terms of my personal journey into this. It was helpful for me. So just to give you an overview of what I'm hoping to talk about today, maybe it's too much and I'll have to move through it. Avanti mentioned slightly that I want to distinguish between masculinity and patriarchy, but I've said and I'll explain why. I want to talk about masculinities in the plural. Um, and then talk about a fairly important concept in masculinity theory, which is called hegemonic masculinity, which kind of everybody who's working on masculinity will reference at least. So I think it's fairly important for people to know and understand. And then I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality and masculinity, talk a little bit about work from Sri Lankan context, um, and then talk about queerness. Um, and then also the kind of big question, right? Like, does masculinity matter to feminist work, right? Which I don't know if I have good answers for, but we'll see, and we can probably discuss that more. So let me start by talking about masculinity versus or and patriarchy. I think it's really important to keep in mind, and particularly for people who work on masculinity, that we distinguish between masculinity and patriarchy, right? And that they're obviously related concepts, but they're not the same, right? So for me, my understanding of patriarchy comes from the work of Maria Mies, who did this famous book called Patriarchy and Capital Accumulation on World Scale. Maria Mies actually passed away this week, so this is partially a homage to her. But Maria Mies, I think, really reminds us that patriarchy is an overall social, cultural, and economic and political system which determines a woman's life from birth to death. And I want to emphasize here the fact that it is a system, that there are many facets to this system, right? And that it also obviously very much impacts the way women live their lives, right? I would add to this that it also impacts the way men live their lives because patriarchy produces certain effects on men as well. The other thing I would say about patriarchy, and again drawing from Maria Mies's work, is that patriarchy is also a system through which of surplus extraction and capital accumulation, right? So these things I think are important to keep in mind because this means that patriarchy is also tied to the economy, right? And the ways in which the economy functions, right? So in this sense, patriarchy is a system that affects both men and women, but there are also very material effects to this system. Uh, so masculinity, obviously men benefit from patriarchy, and I think that's fairly clear in the way Mariam defines um, patriarchy. But I want to define masculinity today as the socially constructed and historically defined. So that means that I'm drawing on the terminology of gender to talk about it being socially constructed, which means there's nothing biological in which men's privilege is given. It's socially constructed privilege. It is also the historically defined, which means that this changes from time to time. But these are ideas, expectations, behaviors, and attributes that men are expected to perform, or men perform and emulate, right? So I want to just distinguish between those two things. So patriarchy as a system of power and domination, and masculinity as a socially constructed and historically defined set of expectations, ideas, and behaviors. Uh, Now, of course, they are linked to each other, but I also want to emphasize slightly here, and not to kind of undercut Maria Mies's point, that men also sometimes can be impacted by patriarchy. Patriarchs are also usually older men, that which means also impacts on how younger men behave. But as we go along, hopefully we talk about this in more complexity. I just want to kind of mark this as a starting point. So talking about masculinity does not mean that I think that patriarchy is a good thing. I think patriarchy is a terrible thing. But that but it's a way of talking about the effects of patriarchy on men as well as women, right? And so it's not a way of saying that women's experiences are illegitimate or that men's experiences are more legitimate. Right? But I think it's important to distinguish these two concepts. So thinking with masculinities, of course, in our societies, I mean, I think things are changing now, but there is this kind of sense that there are two genders, that there are men and women in society. I'm not sure if that is still true, but this is a kind of a sense that that is kind of really kind of dominant in our society. But the idea of masculinities, rather than masculinity in singular, so masculinities as plural, is the suggestion that there are a range of possible ways of being masculine, right? Of masculinity is not just one way of being a man. That there are many different ways of being men, right? So masculinities in the plural then is an emphasis then on those different ways of of in which men, different sets of behaviors, etc., through which men perform their gender. So this is why I'm talking about masculinities in question and contradiction rather than masculinity as a singular, right? And so it's a kind of emphasis on the fact that there are many different ways, and there's definitely no agreement on what those ways should be or could be for how men should behave in our society, right? So I want to come now to this concept of hegemonic masculinity, which is kind of a really central concept in masculinity. It's a concept theorized by R.W. Connell. So the books that and Avanti mentioned to me that there may be people who want to do this for their higher studies. So the books that you might really want to look at is Gender and Power, which she published in 1987, Masculinities in 1995, and then her reworking and reformulation of that concept with another American whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, but um, called Hegemonic Masculinity Rethinking the Concept, right? So from 2005, this is a journal article that is available, right? And if you want the journal article, Avanti, I'm happy to share it with people. I have also shared with Avanti, I think she can put it in the chat, uh, 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 an interview that Connell did on masculinities that may be helpful, right? But to give a very brief overview, of course, it's far more complicated, but a very brief overview of what this concept is. Obviously, the term hegemonic is drawing a lot from Gramsci, right? And this is because particularly this concept kind of emerges in the 80s, as you can see. And Cornell worked in Australia, and so it emerged out of an Australian context, not necessarily an American or a UK or European context, but it emerged out of an Australian context, and it was a way of saying, okay, we recognize that there are multiple forms of masculinity, so there are masculinities, but at certain points of time, certain forms of masculinity gain ascendance, right, through consent, right? So that means there are certain ways of being a man that become standardized, right, and become expected. Now, these may not necessarily be the most uh, prominent, the most form shared by most people. It might be a minority of people, but those things become a standard. An example of this would be, for example, the way the British royal family's masculinity might be thought of as a standard for particular European masculine form of masculinity, and I suppose colonial masculinity. It's not shared by a lot of people. I mean, if you ever lived in countries outside, you would see that there's a variety of different ways in which people perform their masculinity. But there is a way in which a particular form of masculinity gains ascendance, and then that becomes a standard that people are expected to reach and emulate, right? Uh, and this then means that other forms of masculinity are subordinated. So Connell distinguishes between hegemonic masculinity and subordinated masculinities, right? And this kind of is really kind of one of the major theoretical influences in masculinity studies. But also then she also emphasizes the possibilities for change and openness, right? Because certain forms that are hegemonic at certain points of time may not always stay that way. These things could change. So you would think of, for example, again, speaking from more Western context, the kind of the rugged cowboy type masculinity now being changed to a kind of more metrosexual, well-dressed, businessman type form of masculinity has become ideal, right? So these forms of masculinity need not always be static; they're constantly changing, right? But they're changing through consent rather than necessarily through violence, right? And I think that's the kind of important kind of framing that Connell's work brings. There are, of course, limits which Connell themselves and critiques which Connell themselves uh, herself recognizes, particularly in her 2005 article. And I would just point to that article as a useful starting point for thinking about what the critiques also of this concept could be, right? Um, so then I want to move, I mean, that's just a kind of really important kind of theoretical influence to talking about masculinities in question and contradiction. So one of the things that for me interests me is that hegemonic masculinities may often contradict each other. And so for me, some of the work that I have done, I've been really interested in uh, how certain forms of masculinity need not, when we think of hegemonic masculinity, we assume that it's only one form of masculinity that gains ascendance. But what happens when, two or three forms of masculinity kind of start competing with each other? So a little bit of the work that I did was on the presidential election after the end of the war. And I was really interested in how the figure of the father and the figure of the warrior, the battle tested warrior kind of compete with each other in that moment for ascendance, right? And what does that mean? For me, it was like suggesting that there's this real kind of insecurity about masculinity as well, right? So I just wanted to point to the fact that masculinity, just because there is a hegemonic masculinity doesn't necessarily mean it's one form. I think there are constantly different forms of hegemonic masculinity that are battling for prominence and ascendance with each other. I think that also means then asking the question, what gets masked by the predominance of certain forms of masculinity, right? So again, speaking very personally, in the school that I went to, it was very obvious to me that the forms of masculinity that were valued was a form of masculinity that was very much embedded in group sports contexts, right? And whereas queer masculinity or queerness was something that was ridiculed a lot. And so I think the question for hegemonic masculinities, and I think that Connell and others are very aware of, is then what does this kind of certain form or certain prominence of certain masculinity um, get? What does it do to other forms of masculinity? And I will talk a little bit about that also from the Sri Lankan context when I talk about some of the work that has been done on this, because this is something that has also been fairly interestingly talked about. Um, but I just want to flag that. And then I also want to talk about intersectionality, because masculinity doesn't function in a vacuum by in of itself. It is cross-cut by so many different things. These are just some of them. So I think ethnicity, class, caste, religion, sexual orientation, age, all these things play certain influence the way in which masculinities are performed. So I think there are definite differences in the way in what masculinity might mean in some communities. For example, high class Muslim communities or high caste single communities versus oppressed caste communities or other communities, younger people from Muslim communities. I think these things we need to think of these things as intersectional, not just as being masculinity in kind of a singular form or way. Um, the other thing that I thought it might be interesting to flag is the impact of the digital in the formation of masculinity. Um, and one of the things that I thought would be really important to talk about is pornography. I mean, growing up, and I can be very open about this, I think when I was in school, and I'm fairly old now, pornography was very difficult to come by. It was, kind of print material that was shared in class, and was really rare. But now pornography is ubiquitous. It's very easily available. And I think for a lot of young people, particularly young men, um, pornography is one of the major ways in which they're understanding what it means to perform a certain type of masculinity, what their expectations are for intimate relationships, um, and then the impacts that this obviously has on women. And with the idea of digital is also the idea of incel cultures, which is of course gaining prominence in the West now, but I'm guessing it's also there. The idea of being involuntarily celibate, which is a very misogynistic and patriarchal way of believing that a particular form of culture. Um, which then also is a way of talking about toxic masculinity, right? Which is a particular way in which there are various groups and influencers now who are telling young men that this is the way you should behave, that men should behave in particular ways, this is the way women should be treated, this is the way you should treat women, this is the way you should look at women, and this is what women are available to you for. And I say all of this because I want to raise a possible question for us to think about is how do certain forms of masculinity become hegemonic? Through what processes, at what costs, and with what impacts? I think there's a lot more thinking and work to be done on this, and we're still not sure about that, particularly in the Sri Lankan context, which is what I want to talk about next, right? So if you do a Google Scholar search on masculinity, there is um, actually very little that has been done on masculinity in Sri Lanka at the moment. So it's really kind of a rich area for research if people are interested in it. And one second, please. Sorry, one second. I'm just rejecting a call. So one of the major ways in which people have talked about masculinity in Sri Lanka is in terms of militarized masculinity, particularly in relation to the way in which cultures of the military inform masculinity. Particularly here, I would point to the work of Gianni Di Silva, who has worked on Sinhala or militarized masculinity in Sinhala areas, as well as now more recently in Tamil, among former Tamil militants. I think she had a book come out this year on masculinity and embodiment, working with militants. Kumudu Sumeda, who's just currently finishing up her PhD in Australia, is also working on militarized masculinity. I'm not sure if she has published anything yet, but I'm sure she will soon. But there are people who are definitely working on militarized masculinity. I haven't put it here, but Nelufar Dimel's work also, which I will speak about a little bit more specifically in a little bit, will also be someone who has worked on militarized masculinity. Another big area, I suppose, is violence and masculinity. I'm thinking here specifically of the work of Pradeep Jagannathan. It's a really interesting piece I was reading as I was preparing for this on the perpetrators of 1983. Violence in collective identities revisited. Um, I can provide these references to Avanti and Anushka later if you like. Sangam would like them. But Pradeep Jagannathan's work on masculinity and violence, I think he has another one on the village Kamne Chandia, which also I think is really interesting kind of work on masculinity and its relationship to violence, right? Which doesn't necessarily take the kind of militarized kind of former soldier or current soldier kind of model program as its base. And Nelford Email, as I mentioned before, and Malta Dialvis have also done some work on masculinity and disability. Because part of the whole kind of conversation about hegemonic masculinity in Sri Lankan context, at least, is the sense that there is a kind of able-bodiedness to masculinity, right? Like you are there's an ability that you have. And so what happens when you don't, you are no longer able to reach that ideal, right? And so I think in that sense, those questions that Nelpadi Mel asks in militarizing Sri Lanka, particularly, and Malati Dialvis in relation to people, survivors of the tsunami, would be really useful and helpful for thinking about this. There's a little bit of work on masculinity in relation to culture. Neluka Silva has done some work on theater. But again, these are plays uh, about the military. So there's a sense of the militarized sense of masculinity here. And Gaigola has done some work on funny boy and masculinity. So again, some more cultural. Um, the other thing that I thought would be really useful is that CAD International has done a survey on masculinities in Sri Lanka, led by Nilfadi Mel, Pradeep Piris, and Shamala Gomez. I have shared with Avanti the link to that study. It's, I think, more than 1,600 respondents across Colombo, Batiklo, Hambantota, and Nuwara, I think. who participated in this survey. I think it gives a really interesting perspective on the ways in which the views people have about masculinity and in Sri Lanka about violence and in their relationships to intimate partners. I would just caution a little bit of care when reading surveys. The There's this funny story out of this survey is that like uh, a lot of these were also opinions, right, on behaviors. Um, so it's not so these are questions like, for example, do you believe it is okay to have sex with a woman without her consent, right? And 25% of people said yes, right? Um, that it's okay to have sex with a woman without her consent. The way that data was represented, not in the KR report, but somewhere else, was to say that 1 in 4 men in Sri Lanka have raped a woman, right? I don't think that's quite accurate. So I think it's good to be a little careful when we read that survey data. But I think the survey data is really useful kind of to get a kind of more empirical sense, a different kind of a more, not empirical, but more quantitative sense of the way masculinities function. So moving towards the end, let me talk a little bit about queerness and masculinity. Um, and I think this is the way in which, particularly with Butler's work, we've started to think about masculinity as performance, which would be, a particular performative way in which masculinity is performed. Um, but I think Kemal Ellawala, who actually suggested maybe should speak at one of these Sangam events, has done some really interesting work on queerness as creating certain insecurities, possibilities, and ambivalences for masculinities in a piece that just came out, I think, in Feminist Review, right? And I think there are ways in which queerness raises certain questions about the hegemonic forms of masculinity that are prevalent in Sri Lanka today. I think I'm also interested in asking questions of what is the queer masculinity of straight men? And I was talking to Avanti a little bit about the film Maya, which is one of my favorite films by Ranjan Ramanayak. And you find Pubdu Chaturanga's character in the film uh, possessed by a trans woman, and then kind of really querying the masculinity of the straight romantic hero. I think there's a lot of really interesting questions that then emerge by asking about what does queerness do to masculinity? What insecurities does it raise? And what are the possibilities it opens? And then what ambivalences do they create? Right? So the last question that I think we had was, and I don't know if I have really good answers to this question, is just the relationship between thinking about masculinities and feminist work. So I do think it's important to pick our battles. And I think for a lot of feminists, there are lots of battles going on. And I don't know if masculinity is definitely the most important battle that feminists need to fight. But it can be a certain important battle in some ways, um, in the sense that, uh, at, in some way at least, a conversation about power relations and gender relations in society is going to involve talking to men or people who identify as men about the ways in which they behave, their expectations, their understandings of gender in society. And masculinities is a way of understanding a way of having that conversation. You may or may not want to have that conversation. That's completely up to you, but this is one entry point into it, right? But I think most importantly, masculinity is a question for those who identify as men to work through. I think it's a really important question for men to think about because, as I said before, masculinity is often something we take for granted, right? Um, and I think uh, that there's been some really interesting work. I think also, sorry, I should have mentioned Professor Sasanka Pereira's work on masculinity. And today I discovered Dr. Prabha Manoratna has also done some work on masculinity in relation in some of her early work on the celestial underwear. But I'm sure it's something she's also working on today, still working on today. But to come back to masculinities and feminist work, I think it's a really important conversation for men to also engage in, not just women, because sometimes we think that feminist work is only for women, But I think it's also for people, particularly for men who think of themselves as allies or who like to support feminist work, it's an important conversation to engage in. I think the other part of it is also to think about the role that women play in emphasizing specific forms of masculinity. Of course, this is not to blame women or to hold women accountable, but to indicate possibility, right? I know in my own life, the ways in which women have come and told me, you should be doing this or you should be behaving this way. You shouldn't have a partner who's earning more than you, for example, right? Or you shouldn't have a partner who's more qualified than you, right? And so I think there are, in our societies particularly, there are lots of ways in which women also contribute to creating a particular idea of the way men should behave in our society, right? So again, to be clear, I'm not saying that women are to blame for masculinity, men are to blame. But I think it's also a useful kind of way of thinking about what this might mean for women as well. I think finally I'll end by talking about the question of the body. I think I'm ending. Um, I think a lot of the ways in which we think about uh, gender is by distinguishing between the body and the social construction of gender, right? There's something biological, which is sex, and then there is gender, which is social constructed. I think today there is increasingly a conversation of the problem of the body in relation to masculinity and femininity. So the Olympic Committee, for example, recently set out guidelines for how much testosterone a woman can have in her system and based on that, a woman could be disqualified from competing in the Olympics, right? So increasingly, the question of the body is becoming a problem, right? And so that is definitely, it's going to affect not just trans people, but it's going to affect women particularly, right? And I think also with the increasing kind of attention to uh, um, transgender and particularly transgender politics as it becomes a point of contention. This is going to be increasingly become something that we think about, right? And have to think through. And masculinity also brings up the question of the relationship. For me, I mean, I think femininity does too, but it brings up the question of the body in relation to feminist work. So these are just some ideas, some questions, and I'll stop there. Sorry I took so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Uh, I'll try to give a summary in Sinhala, I think. අද සම්බන්ධ වෙලා ඉන්න අයට ඇන්ඩිගේ සාකච්ඡාවේ සාරාංශයක් ලබා දෙන්න. ඇන්ඩි විශේෂයෙන්ම කතා කරේ මේ පුරුෂත්වය කියන එක කොහොමද අපි අපේ විවේචනාත්මක කටයුතු වලට අපි කොහොමද ෆ්‍රේම්වර්ක් එකක් හැටියට යොදාගන්නේ කියලා විග්‍රහයන්ට. ඒ වගේම එයා කතා කරා එයා මේ කොහොමද පෞද්ගලිකව මේ සංවාදයට සම්බන්ධ වුනේ කියලා වරක් එයාගෙන් අහපු ගැටලුවකින් ඔයා කොහොමද ඔයා පුරුෂයෙක් කියලා නිර්වචනය කරගන්නේ කියලා. එතකොට ඇන්ඩි මේකෙදි කියපු දෙයක් තමයි දැන් කාන්තාව කියන කෙනාට ස්ත්‍රීත්වය කියන එක පිළිබඳව සමාජයෙන් සහ අනෙකුත් විවිධ තැන්වලින් ඒ ස්ත්‍රීත්වය කියන්නේ මොකක්ද කියන එක පිළිබඳව යම්කිසි මතක් කිරීම කරනවා විශේෂයෙන්ම දැන් අපේ මෙනස්ට්‍රේෂන් හරහා හරි එහෙමත් නැත්නම් සමාජයෙන් හරි ඉතින් ඒක නිසා අපි නිතරම ඒක පිළිබඳව අවබෝධයෙන් සහ අවධානයෙන් ඉන්නේ. නමුත් පිරිමියාට සමහරලාට ඒක අර ස්වභාවිකම ආපු දෙයක් වගේ දැනෙන ගතියක් තියෙනවා කියලා. සහ එයා කියපු එකක් තමයි මේ පුරුෂත්වය සහ මේ පේට්‍රියාකි කියන එක පිළිබඳ තියෙන වෙනස්කම මොකක්ද කියලා. එතකොට පුරුෂාධිපත්‍ය. පුරුෂාධිපත්‍ය කියන්නේ ඇත්තටම මේ සමාජ ආර්ථික දේශපාලන සංස්කෘතික කාරණා මත ඇත්තටම මේ අධිපතිත්වය පවත්වාගෙන යන්න හදාගත්ත පද්ධතියක් හැටියට තමයි එයා හඳුන්වලා දුන්නේ. විශේෂයෙන්ම මාරියා මීස්ගේ මේ ළඟදී අපාත්‍රෙන් අභාව ප්‍රාප්ත වුණ එයාගේ වැඩවලින් ඉන්ස්පයර් වෙලා තමයි එයා ගැන කතා කරේ. ඒ වගේම තමයි මේ පුරුෂාධිපත්‍ය කියන එක ඍජුවම සම්බන්ධ වෙලා තියෙනවා අපේ ප්‍රාග්ධනයත් එක්ක ඒ කියන්නේ මේක ආර්ථිකමය කාරණයක් ටත් එකතු අනුබද්ධ වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. ඊට පස්සේ නිර්වචනය කරා පුරුෂත්වය කියන්නේ මොකක්ද කියලා. එතකොට ඒක සමාජය විසින් නිර්මාණය කරමින් පුරුෂයා කියන කෙනා ජීවත් විය යුත්තේ එයාගේ හැසිරීම මොන වගේද කියන එක පිළිබඳ නිර්වචනය කරමින් යන ක්‍රියාවලියක්. එතකොට තවදුරටත් කතා කරපු දෙයක් තමයි මේ මැස්කියුලිනිටි එහෙමත් නැත්නම් මේ පුරුෂත්වය කියන එක යම් යම් කාලයට ඒකේ තියෙන නිර්වචන සහ ඒක හඳුනා ගන්න ක්‍රම වෙනස් වෙනවා. විශේෂයෙන්ම ඒකේ යටතෙත් ඉන්නවා යටපත් වෙච්ච පුරුෂත්වෙනුත් තියෙනවා. එතකොට මේක මේ ප්‍රචණ්ඩත්වයෙන් ඇති කරගත්ත මේ එකඟතාවයක් නෙමෙයි. නමුත් යම් යම් කාලවලදී යම් කිසි එකකතාවයන්ට අපි සම්බන්ධ වෙලා මේක තමයි පුරුෂත්වය කියලා අපි ප්‍රතිනිර්මාණය කරගන්නවා. ඒ වගේම තමයි මේ පුරුෂත්වයේ තියෙනවා තවත් අධිපතිවාදී පුරුෂත්වය කියන එක. එතකොට මේවත් කාලෙන් කාලෙට වෙනස් වෙමින් යන සංකල්පයක්. උදාහරණයක් හැටියට ගත්තොත් ඔහු කිව්වා කොහොමද පශ්චාත් යුදමය තත්ත්වයක් තුළ ලංකාවේ කියන්නේ සොල්දාදුවා කියන කෙනා හරහා ලංකාවේ පුරුෂත්වය කියන එක ප්‍රතිනිර්මාණය වෙමින් පවතින්නේ කියලා. ඒ වගේම තමයි මේකෙදි කතා කරන දෙයක් තමයි මේ queerness කියන එක. එතකොට මේ අය කිසිම අපි කතා කරන මේ අර ද්‍රවීමය අපි කතා කරන ස්ත්‍රිය සහ පුරුෂයා කියන මේ බොක්සස් දෙකට යන්නේ නැති අයට අපි ඒ අය කොහොමද මේක දකින්නේ කියලාත් සාකච්ඡා කරා. ඊට අමතරව ලංකාවේ මේ වෙනකොට පුරුෂත්වයේ පිළිබඳව කරලා තියෙන වැඩ ඉතාම අඩු ප්‍රමාණයක් කරලා තියෙන. නමුත් ඒ කරපු අය අතරින් ඒ අයගේ රචනා ගැන ඔහු අපේ අවධානය යොමු කරගත්තා. ඉස්සරහට ඇත්තටම ගොඩක් වැඩ කරන්න තියෙනවා. මොකද හැමෝම අර විවිධ තෝරගත්ත මේ මාතෘකා යටතේ පුරුෂත්වයේ සංස්කෘතිය ඒ වගේ දේවල් ගැන තමයි කතා කරලා තියෙන්නේ. නමුත් තව ගොඩාක් ලංකාවේ පුරුෂත්වයේ කොහොමද අපි නිර්මාණය කරගෙන තියෙන එක පිළිබඳව අපිට පර්යේෂණ කරන්න පුළුවන්. අනිත් එක තමයි මේ පුරුෂත්වය සහ ස්ත්‍රීත්වය කියන එක අපි කොහොමද මේ අපිට නැචරලි මෙහෙමත් නැත්නම් අපිට ජීව විද්‍යාත්මකව හම්බුන දෙයක්ද නැත්නම් සමාජයේ විසින් නිර්මාණය කරපු දෙයක්ද කියන එක පිළිබඳව කතා කරා. සහ මේ පුරුෂත්වය කියන සංවාදයේ ස්ත්‍රීවාදී සංවාදයට කොහොමද සම්බන්ධ වෙන්නේ කියන කාරණය පිළිබඳව ඔහු කතා කරා. විශේෂයෙන්ම මේ සමහර වෙලාවට අපේ සමාජය තුළ ස්ත්‍රියත් මූලික වෙනවා. සමහරලාට පුරුෂත්වය කියන්නේ මොකද්ද සහ ඒක තවදුරටත් පවත්වාගෙන යන්න අර performance ගැන කතා කරා. එතකොට අර පුරුෂයා එක පවත්වාගෙන යනකොට සමහරලාට ඇන්ඩි කියපු දෙයක් තමයි එයාගෙනුත් පෞද්ගලිකව අහන කියන දෙයක් තමයි තමන්ට වඩා වැඩිපුර ඉගෙන ගත්ත ගෑනු ළමයෙක් එක්ක සම්බන්ධ වෙන්න එපා. ඒ වගේ කාරණා කියලා කාන්තාවම සමහරලාට ඒක පවත්වාගෙන යන්න කොහොමද දායක වෙන්නේ කියලා. මේ ඒ සාරාංශයත් එක්ක මම හිතනවා ඉංග්‍රීසි භාෂාවෙන් සාරාංශයක් දෙන්නේ නැහැ. වේලාව ගැටලුවක් තියෙන හින්දා අපිට ප්‍රශ්න අහන්න ආරම්භ කරන්න පුළුවන්. කීප දෙනෙක් සංවාදයට සම්බන්ධ වෙලා ඉන්නවා. මේ ඇන්ඩිට මට ප්‍රශ්න දෙකක් තිබ්බා. හැබැයි කවුරු හරි ඉන්නවද ප්‍රශ්න අහන්න?
නෑ වගේ අවන්තිවා අහනවා නම්.
One question I had was this, I mean, we started about your personal journey and the privilege. So sometimes there's also this notion there's a certain level of privilege and only a certain class would speak about feminism as well. That is also due to because the wealth of the knowledge has also been produced in English, and the scholars and activists are also mainly based in the West. So there's always this notion, whether feminism also comes with privilege. So I just wanted to ask, sometimes you were talking about, how you were raised by your mother. So to question, some of these masculinities, like the fact that how you were trained to cook and, run your chores on your own. So I was just wondering whether kind of being able to challenge masculinity as a man, does it also come with privilege? Because I feel like sometimes there's a lot of pressure for you to be a man as well, if you're coming from a different background, but right now you're also positioned in a certain way that you can question it. And the other thing from the Cornell's, work, the fact about the consent, this is something not written, but, from time to time, maybe a socially agreed upon kind of form of consent. But since you touched upon the Sri Lankan context as well, I was just wondering that she says that violence, this consent is not reached through violence, but violence also plays a certain role in kind of, making a certain masculinity maybe the kind of, cool thing to do around that, particular period. I was just thinking of the Sri Lankan context as well, that, the whole fact about, the soldiers are being valorized, we just passed, 18th of May, and, people are still, kind of appreciating the men who fought for the country. And the fact that, sometimes this camouflage, kind of becomes a fashion in the country. So just wondering, whether there's an element of violence as well that plays into this whole idea of consent to make a certain masculinity, the kind of, the not the subordinated, but the approved kind of masculinity in that particular period of time.
Um, okay, thanks, Avanti. Those are interesting questions. The second one is slightly easier to answer than the first one, so I'll start with that one. Um, so I think what the for me, I understand this through Gramsci, right? And that's I think what Cornell is also using. Uh, for Gramsci, the idea of hegemony, though we use it in different ways, my understanding of the way Gramsci used hegemony, and I could be wrong, is that hegemony is very fragile, right? It's not something that is guaranteed. It has to constantly be struggled over, right? So when something is so fragile, you have to be really conscious about how you maintain its dominance, right? For Gramsci, there are two ways of maintaining dominance. One is through violence, and the other is through consent, right? So violence is far more outright, where you go and beat someone up and say, follow this line, right? Consent may be related to violence. There is always the threat that violence could happen to you if you do not follow it in this way. But that's only part of the equation, right? There are other ways in which um, your consent for certain things is suggested. Now, an example of this, just as a kind of a very crass example, I think we spoke about it a little bit, is the Dutugamunu's, we know the story about Dutugamunu and his father, right? When he refuses to when the father asks him to vow to not attack Ilara in the north, he refuses to do that. He goes to his room and then he sends his father. Various versions of the story. One version says that he sent female undergarments, another is that he sent female jewelry to his father, suggesting that the father was not masculine enough. Right now, for me that's not simply violence. Right, that is a suggestion that is made about a masculinity, about
Mm.
what kind of masculinity you should be, right? And that masculinity, it's an invitation to violence, but it
Mm.
is not Duplicamon going and whacking his father over the head and saying, you should go and attack a land, right? But it is through a sense of shame, right? Through a sense of feminization, right? Like of calling the father a woman,
Mm.
right? That Duplicamon then is able to. It also emphasizes Duplicam's own masculinity, right? As someone who's able to take on his father, who then defeats Elara, right? Like there's all these things. So I think it's not always violence per se through which certain forms of hegemony exist, right? It is also through consent. And then that people then kind of agree with this kind of idea, right? So I think that's what Connell is talking about. That's the way I understand it, right?
Mm.
So it's not always that masculinity is certain forms of masculinity gain prominence not just through their
Mm.
emphasis on violence, right? But like there are so many other ways in which certain forms of masculinity gain prominence, right? Like so even about the military, like part of the conversation that we don't have is about the role of the economy, right? For a lot of people, the military was a way of guaranteed employment. Right? When you didn't have much qualifications, when there was not a lot of job opportunities in the country, the military was guaranteed employment. It was guaranteed pension, right, after 10 or 20 years of service, right, which you did not have in any other way, right? And then that also creates certain cultures, right, among communities about what, uh, it's not just about violence, but also about, kind of the valorization of particular forms of masculinity, right? So I think that's an easier question to answer. The second question is a little bit more challenging. The first question is a little bit more challenging. Yeah, I do think that it is in some ways very privileged to be able to have the space to reflect on these things. I would agree with that, but at the same time, um, I think it's really important for us to have these conversations in Sri Lanka as well, right? Like it's easy to dismiss something and say that something is Western and therefore not relevant to us.
Mm.
That's true, but that doesn't mean that masculinity doesn't function in Sri Lanka. It does, right? It functions in all classes, in all social backgrounds, in all social contexts, right?
Mm.
It is a way in which society is organized, right? Because a lot of our societies are patriarchal, right? So I think having a conversation of masculinity doesn't necessarily mean saying, oh, it's Western, so we don't need to talk about it, right? It's also saying, okay, what are the specific ways in which this thing is happening in Sri Lanka,
Mm.
right? And I can speak from my experiences and say, this is how it came to me, this is how I became conscious of it. And why I kind of spoke personally is also because I don't want to say that this is everybody's experiences, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't have those conversations with yourself or ask those questions from yourself, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Um,
I mean, I think the same is true also of feminism, right? Like, I think we should have a conversation about that
yeah.
locally, but also regionally as well as internationally.
Yes.
I think even with masculinity, like I don't think we're having a good conversation about caste in Sri Lanka, in in many different contexts, which is happening a lot in India at the moment, right? So what would be a conversation about caste and masculinity, for example,
Mm.
in Tamil context, Sinhala context? What would that look like? I think we'll have some really interesting conversations.
Mm.
Thanks for the questions.
Thank you. If we have further questions, we can take them on. We have 3 more minutes. සිංහල භාෂාවෙන් ගැටලු අහන්න පුළුවන් මේ අපිට තව මිනිත්තු 3ක වගේ පොඩි කාලයක් තියෙනවා.
Well, Avanti, I have a little question, a very little simple one, maybe not simple, I don't know. Okay, hi Andy. So there's a question. So when we start to talk about masculinity in our workplace, then people get triggered for nothing. I mean, I don't know to make triggered them, but I just want to discuss something, make some sense with them. But how we can start those conversations without getting triggered. Even when you talk about feminism, it's the same. They're really afraid the word of feminism sometimes, especially for the Sinhala term, not to the English term. For the Sinhala terms, I don't know why, but still I'm trying to figure out like how we can start those conversations with them. Like, what are your advices for that? Really appreciate.
Thank you, Ananta. I feel like I'm really being put on the spot. I mean, I think it's a really, really great question. I think starting conversations is a really important place to start, but starting conversations are not always easy. Um, and I, and sometimes I think people have to be open to conversations. I think, even speaking personally, I don't know if uh, I would have been ready if someone came when I was in school and said, let's have a conversation about masculinity. And I'd be like, what are you talking about? Right? Like, I think um, it's a real challenge. From where to start is a great question. Um, I really don't know your context, Aratara, so it's hard for me to say this is what would work. But for me, what has worked has been in various ways that places that I've worked with is having people that I can talk to who may not necessarily be in that space, but sometimes who are in that space, right? I can maybe just be one person and you just have a conversation. I think one of the really great things I like about Sangam and that Sangam is doing, not to kind of put them on Murungatta, but like to say that like just have a regular space for conversation that people are coming to on a regular basis, um, and that people can listen to, right? And that's available later on for people to listen to as well, and that you can then share with people that might be open to the conversations. But if people are close to conversations, I don't know. Yeah, there are things that you could try, but I don't know if those tend to sometimes backfire more than they work. But I think for me, the place that I would start personally, I prefer one-on-one conversations with people rather than kind of big group things that uh, that that seem really great and seem like really flashy and all of that. But sometimes one-on-one conversations are a great place to start, and maybe finding people who share your views or resonate with kind of the questions that you have might be one place to start. As to the larger things, I'm sure there are like others might also have ideas as well. Maybe Anushka or Avanti. Uh, Prabha, I think, has put something in the chat. Yeah, but she's also suggested was starting with points of common oppression. I think this is also something that a lot of feminist circles. I mean, Prabha, do you want to talk about this? Maybe rather than me pontificating on this
Yeah,
or not?
Prabha.
No, okay. But
No, sorry. I just sort of flashed an idea that no, I don't want to. Yeah, no, I was just thinking also if you want to talk about masculinities, to start talking about how patriarchy is oppressive for everybody, not just for women, and to sort of begin with just gay people. It's not only women who are receiving at the receiving end of oppression of patriarchy. And usually, if you can find a common ground, then it's a lot easier to have the conversation, especially if you're a feminist, because men generally tend to think that feminists are against men. So that's what I was saying. Thank you. I didn't have to talk though. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabha. Thank you so much.
hope that answered your question. Sorry, that wasn't a very great answer, but I'm glad that
Yeah.
came.
Yes, thank you so much, both Tia and Prabha.
We can take maybe one more question if anyone is interested. So if we don't have further questions, maybe we can wind up for today. I would actually like to thank Andy for joining with us and for kind of initiating this discussion with Sangha. And we look forward to actually take this discussion forward because it's very much important to, discuss within the discussions that we have had, already on feminism. And Thank you very much for those who attended today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next discussion. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you.